Hello and thank you for joining us for episode 2 of the Parliament Podcast. I'm your host Andy Segedin, online managing editor for Temple Law Review Volume 91. Today we'll be speaking with Judge Nelson Diaz about his forthcoming memoir, Not From Here, Not From There. The book discusses Judge Diaz's career on the bench and in government, and barriers he broke along the way as an attorney of Puerto Rican descent. We hope that you enjoy. I am very pleased to welcome Judge Nelson Diaz to the podcast today. Judge Diaz is a 1972 graduate of Temple Law, the first Latino judge to serve in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, general counsel for the Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Clinton, and city solicitor under Mayor Street. We will be discussing his memoir, Not From Here, Not From There, coming out from Temple University Press in a few short weeks. Judge Diaz, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. And as you know, I'm a Temple-made lawyer.
Excellent. Great to hear. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to run through the book. I had the chance to read through it, and as you know better than anybody, it's a very expansive book. So I'm going to try to bounce around and cover as much as we can in our time here. And I guess the first question I want to ask is, this book is obviously very intensely personal. You talk about your successes, obviously, and your career path, but you also bring up your modest upbringing, your struggles in school, divorce, and you said that, I guess from the very intro of the book, that the idea came from your viewing of the hurricane response in Puerto Rico. Can you explain how that kind of triggered you wanting to write this, and kind of how your process and mindset coming in?
Well, I started before the hurricane, but the hurricane sort of gave me an opportunity to show an example of the colonial mentality that exists among the Puerto Rican community. I hope that by being personal about my life story, that it can serve to be a more universal story. Latinos positively contribute to the well-being of our country. My story demonstrates some of the many ways I think Latinos contributed to America. I hope that this book is seen as in a bigger context than just my story. In the backdrop of the negative and racist attitudes about Latinos being only criminals and rapists, my story is one of many Latinos who work hard every day to put food on their table, house their families, and as best they can also to educate their children and to have equal opportunities for the future. And basically, isn't that what I guess is the American dream? And that's where I'm trying to focus, is to show that there is more than just the fact that children are not given, particularly at 15 years old, when I made my change, are given that kind of opportunity to change their lives.
And I guess kind of keeping with that kind of theme in the next few questions here, I guess in the book you talk about, I know you said you're a Temple made, but you weren't even 100% sure that you wanted to go to law school. You kind of applied to Temple on a whim. And I guess you talk about, in addition to the workload, which I know everybody can kind of attest is a struggle, you talk about the trouble you had with the lack of diversity on campus. And I believe that you were the first Latino to pass the Pennsylvania bar. I know that diversity is something that universities, big firms, the profession as a whole continues to struggle with. I guess, how have you seen that evolve or maybe fail to evolve during your career?
Well, I never thought law was available to me. It was obviously Professor Stapleton at St. John's University and Peter Leocoris at Temple that encouraged me to be a lawyer and to look at that as a possibility. But growing up as a poor Puerto Rican kid from Harlem, there were always stereotypical attitudes that were barriers to overcome. A school counselor believing that you are not college material, or institutional or systemic bias in the law school, government, law, and the fact that even firms and corporate boards that lack diversity, even they are highly suspect of highly qualified people of color. This is why civil and human rights are important issues that I've spent a lifetime fighting for, whether it was becoming the founding member of the Black Law Student Association, or whether it was developing a powerful coalition of people of interest, or becoming a community activist protesting the lack of diversity and opening the law school doors, as you saw, for others, and promoting economic development, as you see in terms of the Latino community, or breaking the barriers and becoming the first Puerto Rican White House Fellow. Where working with Vice President Mondale, I was able to promote Latino diversity even in the White House and in a political arena, and influence public policy both domestically and internationally, or breaking the judicial barriers and becoming the first Latino judge in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or the first minority administrative judge in the history of Pennsylvania. And I presided over court reforms that brought the 7-year backlog cases to the present and simultaneously saved the courts millions of dollars. And when I was fighting for human rights, as you can see from the book, for Soviet Jewry, where I was arrested in the Soviet Union, or being the first American judge to sit on a Japanese court system because they talked about the fact that their homogeneity was greater than the diversity we have. And I also fought against desegregation, both in housing, nationwide, in the school system here early in Philadelphia in the 1970s, or promoting inclusion and promotion of minorities and women lawyers in the profession. And I was always fighting for diversity on corporate boards as I was about 30 years old. So I spent a lifetime of trying to break barriers so others can walk through the door. You know, I may have been the first person that did what was in those areas, but I didn't want to be the last. As you can see, I try to continue to break those barriers. So law was something that was a great instrument for me to be able to use, but not something that I ever thought was going to be available to me. All I wanted was a job. When I went to law school, to St. John's, to undergraduate school, and heck did I know that people really felt that I could make it beyond that.
And just kind of skipping ahead in your story just a little bit, because I want to stay on that same topic, and you just described, after school you ended up as a White House Fellow under the Carter administration, and you spent a few years at Wolf Block, and then you became the at 33 the first Latino judge in Pennsylvania history. And I know that Judge Sanchez was recently became the first the Eastern District of Pennsylvania's first Latino chief judge. And I guess you see it in the news all the time now. There's a lot of interest in racial disparity among those incarcerated. I know that there's a push, at least in the Eastern District, for greater diversity in jury pools. I guess, how do you see diversity among judges kind of factoring into this broader discussion that we see in the newspapers a lot?
Well, recently, I began reading a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. It talks about mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. She argues that a new racial caste system has developed that once you've been labeled a felon, all forms of discrimination now become legal. Housing and employment discrimination, denial of the right to vote, educational opportunities, and exclusion from jury services. With the racial disparities of blacks and brown incarceration, it is more important than ever to have diversity not only among judges rendering sentences, but the entire law enforcement system. The police, prosecutors, and judges need to be diverse and reflect the communities they represent. We have come a long way, but obviously not far enough, especially considering what the stakes are. When I worked for Vice President Mondale, who authored the Fair Housing Act, then working in Camden on the Maloro Fair Housing case, and then working in tenant landlord litigation as a young law student in Camden Legal Services and litigating that, and having been discriminated myself by realtors and housing communities, as you can read from the book, and working on HUD allowed me to make a historical impact on these issues of fair housing. And as you know, last year, the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on disparate impact, which was sort of my main achievement and Cisneros' legacy at HUD, was made legal by the U.S. Supreme Court. So those are the kinds of things that I never thought from the beginning then as a law student till now the end of my career. have been a consistent factor in my life.
And to circle back a little bit at your time as a law student here at Temple, and I know that as students, sometimes we look at extracurricular activities and organizations. We're not thinking necessarily of how it'll shape our future. You talk about it in the book, and you just talked about it a few moments ago. The Black Law Students Association, and kind of helped you get into the political and minority advocacy that you enjoyed as a student in the early 1970s, and how you kind of continued throughout your career. I guess, how did that organization kind of shape you and kind of frame how you approached your career?
Well, Dr. Martin Luther King, was an incredibly profound influence in my life, and was a hero. He died in '68 when he was assassinated, and the program that allowed me to get into law school has a lot to do with Martin Luther King's passing, because then in '68, and then I was the second class of this Council on Legal Education opportunity that was created to provide opportunities for African American Latinos. And then people talked about him as a civil rights leader, and I agree that of course he was a civil rights leader, but coming from my background and understanding of my faith as I was transformed, I see Dr. Martin Luther King as a preacher who was living his faith. He was engaged in the struggle of his time, and I too have been engaged in the struggle for civil and human rights, inclusions and opening doors for others, which I continue to do to make sure that people can continue to walk behind me. As you indicated, as a founding member of BOLSA, I understood how powerful coalitions of interest are and the importance of student activities to make changes. Growing up in Harlem, I was very, very comfortable being with the African Americans. As you know, I played baseball with a coach who was from the Negro Leagues, and not only that, but all the players were African Americans but me. So students tend to understate their ability to make systematic changes. We were able to increase the number of minorities and women in the law school, the undergraduate school, and pick leaders like Leah Corris who believe in the equality of opportunity, who made not only the law school better, but the university also got better when he became president, and I had an ability to help and influence that process. So faith and hope requires loving your fellow person to allow them to reach their full potential. And Peter had an incredible vision with regard to that, and I am greatly indebted to him for encouraging me to do the law school thing, work with the community in Philadelphia, and stay here and make a difference in the community. He always used to say, "Hey, finish what you started."
I remember that in the book. And before you even left for the Carter administration, I guess, still staying in the very early part of your career, you mentioned, I guess, being active in the community even after law school. And I know you were at the Public Defender's Office. You were active among another number of groups, including the Spanish Merchants Association. And you describe, and I guess this is something that maybe some of us who aren't from Philadelphia or maybe are too young might not remember, but you describe, I guess, a lot of racial tension in Philadelphia at the time, and you particularly describe, I guess, some really kind of disturbing events in the Port Richmond area. I guess for those of us who may not kind of appreciate Philadelphia's roots that aren't necessarily too old at this point, I guess, can you describe some of what you were seeing at the time in your earlier career?
Well, there were dividing lines among many of the neighborhoods in our city, and tension existed in Feltonville, Fishtown, the Northeast, the Spring Garden area, as well as many other areas in Philadelphia. I talk about the Julio Osorio and the Santiago firebombing, which were examples of a couple of the many incidents that I had to deal with in Philadelphia to protect the community. I even had a house in Kensington vandalized before there was a chance to move in. And there was a guy by the name of John Daly, who was a child in North Philadelphia, who was retaliated by a bunch of Latino youths, and they killed him with a bat. And for those of us who might not have been around at the time, you can describe some of what the city was facing at the time, which was, Frank Rizzo was a tough cop. We had the Vietnam War. There was the killing of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. There was the Black Panthers, who was a party of activists. There was the Yellow Lord Party, which is an offshoot of the Black Panthers, Puerto Rican group, who were a number of activists. There was very little access to education in the universities or even jobs. There were incredibly poor housing conditions in North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia. And then white neighborhoods were blaming the victims, afraid of what could happen to their neighborhood if drugs, HIV, and poor conditions would occur if those folks moved into their neighborhoods. And then of all of that, there was redlining in many of the areas of color by the financial institutions in Philadelphia. So it was a tough picture for anyone of color who would try to move in and out in terms of the boundaries. If you cross, for example, Front Street where the L is, that's where you had some incidents that were obvious because there was you didn't belong there.
Yeah. And you just described housing as a concern during this time of racial tension and in some cases segregation. I guess housing is an issue that I think almost every chapter, at least of your book, something about housing pops up. I think it's a common thread. And you talk a lot about, especially earlier in the book, kind of living in squalor and without a lot of supervision in West Harlem. And then you also talk about your efforts to keep the Philadelphia Housing Authority afloat, and how after I know you considered the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, you considered EEOC, and you ended up at HUD, I guess during a time where these kind of housing segregation questions were a national issue during the early 1990s. I guess housing continues to be an issue nationally, an issue locally, and I know that a lot of attention has been paid to the city council making a few proposals in the past year or so for kind of more mixed income housing in the city. I guess what do you carry with you from your time at HUD, your time just as a person who's experienced all these kinds of different situations that kind of frames how you look at kind of local housing issues today?
That's a very deep question in my heart, because housing makes a difference as to where you live, where you go to school, and what your zip code was determines a lot of your future life. And I was a beneficiary of public policy who for the first time slept in a public housing unit. It was my first room and my first bed alone at 10 years old. So I understand why public policy is so important in terms of assisting the poverty situation in our country. And so it was not necessarily intellectual. It was really an experience that I had, and I knew what it took to manage appropriately public housing. And so when I was general counsel at HUD, I issued what was known as the Diaz opinion, which became the landmark opinion that transformed public housing, because it allowed the public housing authorities to create a public-private partnership to effectuate mixed financing developments to create mixed income affordable housing developments. And if you want to see an example of that, all you have to do is come down to Bainbridge Street and see the Martin Luther King housing, and that has occurred throughout the country in terms of getting rid of high-rises in Baltimore, for example, or in Chicago or in other areas where it really didn't work, and we limited most of the high-rises here, even in Philadelphia. What I have proposed also when I was running for mayor was that there be an 80-20 mix for all housing in Philadelphia to provide affordable housing. Anytime you have any money that is either locally or nationally put into any housing, by creating this 80-20 mix, you will provide similarly mixed opportunities of public-private opportunities, that you will have people of different income backgrounds into the housing area. That obviously is not being done, but that's the only way we're going to be able to provide affordable housing for all of our citizens in Philadelphia, by everybody really supplying what I call public-private venture opportunities.
And just to follow up on that quick point, because I know that I remember the 80/20 proposal that you had, and also I know that a lot of cities and counties have made similar proposals, maybe at maybe like a 90/10 or a 95/5 or whatever the case is. I know Newark, New Jersey, for instance, has an 80/20, but it's only for much larger construction. I guess, what do you see as a barrier, or what's caused? I guess, why is that? I guess something that's been kind of elusive, not only here in Philadelphia, but all over the country.
Because a lot of the private developers don't want to give up that 20% that would enable them to bring in poor folks into their house, because then you would have a Section 8 certificate, which was a HUD certificate. You would have to also allow people with lower incomes to come into that housing, and there'd be a controlled amount which would be payable based upon their income, hopefully controlling that to a percentage of hopefully no more than 30% of their income, their monthly income. And so they're all really not willing to be a partner in these things, and they're trying to maximize whatever they can in terms of the profit motive that are available to them. And if we're going to live in a city that is going to exist appropriately, we need both the poor and the rich to essentially have some contribution in the process, and the opportunity of having a private sector do it is that it controls the management, the cleanliness, the landlord-tenant situation, the eviction issue, and it's run appropriately like a business, which is what I try to do with most of the public housing authorities on the country, is to have them run, not just collect rent, but to run them like a business so that they do more than just sit on their desk and wait for collections.
And after your time at HUD, you I guess, headed over to Blank Rome, obviously one of the bigger firms in the city, and you talk about how you're just kind of finding your groove, you're satisfied in that regard, and then the city solicitor position is made available to you, and you describe it as some of the most rewarding work of your life. I know you enjoyed kind of bouncing around all over the city and getting your hands into a number of different issues. I guess, what do you remember most about that time? And I guess, what would you say? I know one of your fellow alums, Marcel Pratt, just took over the job earlier this year. I guess, what would you say to him, and kind of, looking back at your time under Mayor Street?
It's wonderful for you to be reminded that I went to Blank Rome because Gerard DiCarlo, who was a famous lawyer in the city and then the managing partner, had recruited me about 6 years earlier to the firm, and I kept saying that I was going, and then I kept postponing it once because I became administrative judge, postponing it again because I went to HUD, and so I felt an obligation to honor the relationship I had there. And so when I had honored that relationship and had done well there at the firm, he was shocked when I said, well, I need to help John Street because John Street has some issues, and I've committed to stay with him through the election. Little did I know there will be a lot of problems there. And so I was proud of a number of opinions that I was able to be involved with, things that I had to reverse some prior solicitors. So one of the things that Marcel should look at is, don't, just because a prior city solicitor has an opinion doesn't mean that you should take that as gospel, even though the charter indicates that you're the final arbiter of the charter. But there were several opinions, for example, that I was most proud of. One was that I allowed city workers to contract with the city for foster care or for adoptions, which a prior solicitor had opined another way. This opened up more homes for children and also enabled me to put more lawyers into the family court area to work on issues that enabled more foster care and more ability for the city to be able to place a number of things. The second opinion that a lot of people take credit for today, but which I opined at the time, was that the federal government and not the city was obligated to enforce the immigration laws, and the city could not and should not deny services to anyone. And that was part of the whole immigration issue that the federal government was trying to impose upon the police department and others to have an unfunded mandate when they had enough work to do and require. But things that people may not have seen that were an opportunity was because I had relationships in Washington, I was able to help in the regulatory area, like the airport. I was able, when they did the international airport, to bring the tachometers, the modern ones, instead of the old ones, because I had relationships at the FAA, and so we didn't have to put the old ones and then change them again and put the new ones in. And so we were first on the list to be able to get that. At PGW, I was able to work on making sure that we worked that operation regulatorily correct and to try to improve the management of it. The convention center, I sat on the convention center, and the convention center, as you know, I filed a lawsuit, which we won in the Supreme Court, and then allowed the legislature to then impose it appropriately, which then allowed then Councilman Nutter to become the chairman, which he wouldn't have qualified for if I hadn't taken the suit. And so, I was suing on the fact that he wasn't qualified. And remember, Street had this great housing program that Nutter eliminated, which really did more for housing development in North Philadelphia and in West Philadelphia of market rate housing than anyone else. And so he really was one of the few mayors that had real development in the minority neighborhoods, including the drug enforcement, where he was able to clean up a number of corners. And then I was very active in many of the boards that were involved in economic development, like PIDC and the collection batters, which at one time I had to resolve a case relating to the Liberty Plaza when it was traded underhanded by a partnership, and they tried to avoid the transfer tax. And then I cleaned up. There was an affirmative action group there that was costing the law department $1 million, and I got rid of that department completely and used private lawyers on a contingency basis for that, and whenever I needed to do, and I didn't have to do that often. I did it maybe once or twice, like when the fire occurred at Fairmount Park or that situation. So it was a savings of $1 million, which then I used to settle all the civil rights cases that existed. And then I worked with, now who is Justice Doherty, but then he was the administrative judge in the family court, to professionalize the issues of subpoenaing power and making sure that we didn't delay cases and keep the kids in prison more than we had to. And then when the city courts wanted to increase their budget, they were going to file a lawsuit, and because I had taken care of that, they withdrew the lawsuit because I knew more than they expected anybody else to know. So they didn't want me to be an adverse witness. And so it was really a wonderful opportunity to work in so many different areas of the law that it was a pleasure to be and to do that kind of jobs. And that's why I said it was fun. But you have to always make sure that you have the trust both of the city council, who you represent, the mayor, when sometimes there's conflict. And so I had, I believe, an incredible relationship with both of those folks, So that really worked well for me.
And I guess after, I know you were there for the first, Mayor Street's first term, and then after leaving as city solicitor, you go back to Blank Rome, then you go to Cozen O'Connor, then you finally end up at Dilworth Paxson. And you talk about in the book, and I know you alluded to it a few moments ago, that you ran for mayor, and you had a platform on a number of issues, including education, housing, as you mentioned, and taxes. I guess that didn't work out, but I guess, do you still look out for opportunities in local government? I guess, how do you stay involved after, all these years of in government and in community activism?
Yeah, I still stay involved in a lot of the nonprofits. I was motivated to run for mayor because of a school in Camden known as LEAP, which graduates 100% of their kids and 100% go on to college. And so I felt that I could really transform that kind of project into the city. And I learned a lot in terms of the process of trying to run for office. And I think I'm finished trying to run for anything. But
okay.
I continue to look for opportunities for positive change. I presently was the co-founder and involved nationally with what's known as the Latino Corporate Directors Association, which is a group that's looking to increase the number of Latinos on Fortune 500 boards. Presently, there are about a little over 2% of Latinos on corporate boards, but the $1 trillion buying power of Latinos are not reflected in the boardrooms of America. So I'm still working on those opportunities. I'm hoping that this book can be somehow a motivating factor for all the children of the public school system here, so that they can realize that you don't get angry, you don't get frustrated, you just keep striving and pushing on, and you have hope, and let your faith sort of carry you on, and realize that you're worth saving.
And finally, I guess I know we talked about a few threads that run through the book. Obviously, diversity or lack thereof is one, housing is another. But I guess one of the main takeaways, having read through this, is how often in your story you said yes. And it seemed like no matter how settled you were at a job, or how happy you were, or how much you liked, where you were living, if an opportunity that interested you presented itself, you kind of jumped in. I guess for young lawyers, I'm assuming a lot of people who might be listening are young lawyers, or maybe just law students kind of trying to pave their own path. I guess, how would you suggest kind of navigating your career? I guess, what would you suggest, and what maybe from your career would you suggest they kind of emulate in some way? Yeah,
one of the things about saying yes all the time is sometimes you don't know what you're getting yourself into. And and when I said yes, obviously, to the mayor's race, that was a lost opportunity of over $3 million, which would have been enough for me to be able to get the book to as many people as possible. But I thought it was important to get the message out and be able to be forceful on the needs of the public school system. And I think I was able to change the dynamics of the arguments during the mayor's race on education, as you can see from the pre-K beginnings and the talking of the mayor of the community school system. So, and I talked about, retaking the board from the SRC, and they're retaking the board. So I'm sort of satisfied that at least that has become an issue that the mayor has had to take ownership over, and I'm hoping that that will make a difference in the school system and will help so many of the kids, because we still have the poorest population in Philadelphia of any congressional district in the country. So the main takeaway, obviously, is no matter how negative it looks like it's out there, we have to believe that we and one person can make a difference in a person's life. And so that I would hope that each one of these lawyers feel, whether they're in the private sector, they don't have to make the sacrifices that I made of moving into North Philadelphia or giving up their income or giving up, but that if they can take just one situation at a time to make a difference in people's lives and provide as much help to the communities, and because law is an opportunity of change, that navigating that will not only help their career but satisfy them, because large firms and this corporate area, it's an incredible process that requires you to take a stand. And taking a stand has enabled me to make the first CEO of a major electrical company in the nation, taking a stand, sort of made sure that people weren't wasting the pension monies of the workers, taking a stand, made you see that you could also make major contributions to the corporation's bottom line and in turn be respected and be assisted in the community. So I think those are the kinds of things that have paid off for me, having the integrity and the willingness to work towards not being the last, even if you're the first, second, or third, not being the last.
And just for point of clarification, for those who might not have read the book yet, you mentioned, I guess, the risk and the financial risk of running for mayor. That's because you were serving on the board of Exelon at the time, and I guess you gave that up to run. So yeah, I just want to make sure that people who might be confused know that. I guess finally, and one of the things I'm trying to do with every
I was on a Fortune 500 company for over 12 years. And that also has ramifications in terms when they read about the Puerto Rican Maria hurricane situation, where I had the expertise and the ability to be able to help them, and not being from there, which is part of the title of the book, to some extent they did not want to follow our support and advice.
Gotcha. And finally, I guess from everything I'm trying to, for every podcast that we're doing, I'm trying to ask our guests one last question, and it's something that maybe people who are interested in what we're talking about, or maybe it's something we didn't touch on, or maybe something that our less sophisticated listeners might just want to say to sound well informed at a local watering hole. I guess for people who are either listening right now or who are going to read this book, I guess what is one thing from your story that you hope they kind of get out of it? If there's only one thing, what is it?
Yeah, I would like to inspire young people to know that life is not over at 15. No matter what's happening, there's always a way out, and it's important never to give up hope and keep striving. You must be able to have integrity in all you do and find personal and professional mentors to assist you all along the way. Continue to raise your expectations for yourselves, even if others don't think you can achieve it. Believe in yourself and be proud of who you are. Being engaged in something greater than yourself is critical for a lasting impact. And not forgetting to open doors for others is really important to me. As you know, that many others have walked through, many who have mentioned in the book. Creative leadership and coalition building can foster a lot of positive change. And so there are people who intervene in your life throughout and allow them to intervene. You know, from the beginning, you saw Leroy Otis in the baseball. You saw the church intervention. You saw the intervention of mentors like Howard Gittes, and you saw interventions of people even at my age here, like Jack Cavini. So important for people to see that there are people who may want to intervene and provide you their scope of assistance, so you understand that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but that they can walk you through the wheel. And that's been an incredible accomplishment in my life, of which I am extremely grateful for those interveners.
Excellent. Well, Judge Diaz, again, for those listening, the book is Not From Here, Not From There. It is forthcoming. It's coming out, I believe, in October from Temple University Press. Judge Diaz, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
And they should know that if it makes any money, it all goes back to Temple Law School for the establishment of a civil rights chair and for scholarships for law students.
Oh, that's good. That's very useful to know. Excellent. Well,
so
thank you so much.
There's no money for me in this.
Okay, that's good to know. Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it very much, and I hope that many people get a chance to realize that let's not lose hope, and let's continue to work together on making things better for our children and our children's children.